Hello and welcome to The Last Picture House, the show devoted to an in-depth discussion of classic films. I'm your host, Marcus Lovett, and I'm joined by fellow spiritual warriors Maria Suzuki, Ian Norton, and Di Lynch. This episode, is there such a thing as an unfilmable novel? Why are some projects classed as visionary while others are labelled folly? We'll be looking at Norwegian Wood, based on Haruki Murakami's novel, Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and finally, Frank Herbert's Dune, which at different times has been tackled by Alejandro Jodorowsky, David Lynch, and soon, Denis Villeneuve. And if you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe on iTunes, podcast player, or your preferred podcasting app. This month sees the release of Catch-22 as a 6-part miniseries on Hulu. Based on Joseph Heller's iconic book of the same name, it's not the first time the novel has been adapted to the screen. Director Mike Nichols, of The Graduate fame, adapted the book in 1970 to lukewarm reviews. This got us thinking, is there such a thing as an unfilmable novel? Should ambitious classics like Heller's Catch-22 be lumped in with the pulpy thrillers, graphic novels, and self-help books that feed the Hollywood sausage machine? Or should some books be left alone? Maria, what are your thoughts?
When I hear about unfilmable books and is there unfilmable books, I think about, in a different context, what director Truffaut said when he was asked if there were bad movies. And he said, there are no bad movies, there are bad directors. So I would say there are not unfilmable movies, there are good screenplays, good scripts, I think. So I don't think there anything that should be left alone or that's unfilmable, because I think that since the beginning of any form of art, even before cinema, there was the urge to transport it in a visual way, even sacred texts like the Bible, for example. So there's, through painting, through sculpture, the urge to transport something into a visual form has always been like an instinct for humanity, I think. So the concept that something that a book should be left alone, I don't think that is valid.
Ian, same question. Is there such a thing as a sacred text?
I mean, I think I agree with what Maria was saying. I don't think there's anything so much as a sacred text. I think it's down to not just the director, but the screenwriter and the screenplay itself and their relationship with the original source material. But I do think there are certain books that I wonder, why would you even try and film that? Like, I don't understand why you would think that could be translated onto a film. Something like Robert Redford, who's been obsessed with making Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, and the seminal text by Robert Pirsig. And I just don't see how that would work as a piece of cinema.
How about you, Dai?
I think I'm largely in agreement with everybody here. Once you take something and you put it onto a new work of art, then you're dealing with totally different types of interpretation. So you get onto adaptation quite quickly when we talk about books. I don't like the idea that there isn't nothing is sacred, and I think anything should be available. But at the same time, and I'm going to sound very elitist when I say this, like, there are certain people I wouldn't want taking on certain works, and I wouldn't want to see a certain book go down a particular route, if you know what I mean. And I take the inverse of that. If you think like Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, I think Paul Verhoeven did such a fantastic job interpreting that book in the fascistic lens which he did. Certain people shouldn't do things, but overall, no, we should definitely do it.
Yeah, I think that's key as well. The director, the people involved have to kind of match the source material. Like, you don't want to see Michael Bay's version of
Little Women. I would want to watch it.
All right, so let's break down some of the main issues of adaptation. There's visualizing the interior world of the novel. There's question of tone, so match the novel or choose something different. And then there's the narrator's voice, as well as how to deal with an unreliable storyteller. Ian, maybe you could give some examples of how filmmakers have successfully created visuals to match source material.
One of my favorite films is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and because the film is so ramshackle and rambling, and they lurch from drink to drink to drug, and that's exactly what the book is. I think the film really encompasses the spirit of the book, but I think a lot of that's down to how close the director and especially Johnny Depp got to Hunter S. Thompson himself. They spent a lot of time together. Even Johnny Depp's wearing some of Hunter S. Thompson's clothes in the film. He lent it to get that original voice. But also, if you're going to do Mad as Bicycles, you want Terry Gilliam in charge. If the stories on set are true, the filming itself was particularly gonzo, which really does match Hunter S. Thompson's style of writing. And Gilliam brings a lot of that experience from the Monty Python films themselves. My biggest thing is, though, I did watch the film before reading the book, which I think might be key, because now whenever I read any other Hunter books, I can only hear Johnny Depp's voice in there.
It's a long time since I saw it, and I remember it being kind of fragmentary, but that didn't matter. So in the case of Catch-22, the fragmentary thing I found got in the way of me engaging with the material, and so I'm talking about the Mike Nichols film here, not the TV series. But in the case of Fear and Loathing, I remember it being fragmentary, but it was such a crazy ride that it didn't really bother me.
On the visuals itself, Ralph Steadman, who's the illustrator for Hunter's books, was also heavily involved in the production. He designed some of the props and things like that. So I think that also helped visualize the world.
So, an epic adaptation was Lord of the Rings. Why did that work, but geeks such as yourself complained about the tone of The Hobbit?
Well, and that's such a big question as well, isn't it? And I think a lot of that comes down to...
It's a big film, Di.
It's a very, very big film. It comes down to the studio conditions and the actual system of making that book and taking it to the screen. And I'm talking specifically here about the trouble with directors like Guillermo del Toro taking charge and then dropping out. And it was obviously a very, very, very difficult working conditions for everybody involved. There was the big strike of actors working in New Zealand, and it was just not the conditions conducive to making a good movie. And then that's even before we start talking about whether it should have been 3 films, whether you're stretching the material very, very thinly, of what is largely considered to be the children's introduction to The Lord of the Rings. Because The Hobbit was written for children, it's a children's book. I think treating it in the way that a lot of the Hollywood system would have expected, like Lord of the Rings, where you've got this big narrative,
epic fantasy for adults.
Yeah, culminating in these huge CGI battles and things. I don't think The Hobbit is an unfilmable film for various reasons. We've ended up having a very, very mediocre and boring movie. But The Lord of the Rings was considered an unfilmable book for years. And the reason at the time, the technology just wasn't available. People just couldn't imagine or visualize how you would even begin to show epic battles of orcs and trolls versus humans or dragons and everything else in these huge cities. With The Lord of the Rings, the movies that Peter Jackson made, the trilogy, it sort of sparked this sort of revolution in filmmaking. Now, I mean, we're just ending the run of the Game of Thrones, and it just goes to show sort of how normalized that these big sweeping narratives have become in our collective consciousnesses. We're kind of used to them now. And the idea of going back to, say the 70s, when they tried to make the animation of The Lord of the Rings, 1978, the Ralph Bakshi work, and even then they were struggling to get that off the ground, and conceptually visualizing that book seemed almost impossible. But now it's the easiest thing in the world. Game of Thrones, we're almost shrugging our shoulders going, yeah, it's all right.
And I think another point with Lord of the Rings is Peter Jackson spent a lot of time trying to work out what parts to keep in and what parts to take out, and I think he did really well to keep in the core narrative, but then maybe lose some of the pieces that would have drifted away into a much more complicated film to watch. But with The Hobbit, they included everything and a whole bunch of stuff.
It had been decided it was going to be 3 films. And as soon as you do that, you're now trying to kind of push more into it. So the footnotes are now part of the narrative, right?
And there's whole sections that aren't even in the original source material that were cut from some of the other books and sort of forced in. And there's the whole bit where it just turns into a video game for a while, where they're going down the river in the barrels. It wasn't about keeping the best bits. It was just keeping everything to justify the 3 films.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, I feel like they were buoyed by the success of including characters like some of the Elven characters that were written specifically for The Lord of the Rings, that weren't really, they were sort of side characters, but they were very much fleshed out, giving Aragorn a love interest, giving him sort of the more traditional leading man arc. But you're right, as soon as you try and do that with The Hobbit, and the problem is, you turn it into 3 films, that means you need 3 climaxes. The good thing about The Lord of the Rings is, it's quite structured. I mean, once you sort of take out the time hopping of the 2 towers, so I believe that in the books, the 2 towers are running parallel to some of the events of Return of the King, but once you fiddle that around and you put that into a straight narrative line, it becomes much easier. And so that was very, very, very successful. But taking that and then turning it into 3 films for The Hobbit and stretching those narrative threads thinner and trying to include 3 climaxes. I mean, the climax of the 3rd film of The Hobbit, it's the 5 armies, that is a couple of pages in the book. And it's not even the point of that book. The point of the book is obviously Bilbo and his adventures, and to have this sort of largely pointless battle and the shoehorning in, and then it's the retconning of having the Sauron coming through, and it doesn't work. It's a very messy film. It's wholly unsatisfying, and it's just really kind of boring.
I knew you were the right person to answer that question, Dai. So, talking about how you structure a narrative, and you can follow the book or you can impose another kind of structure over it. Maria, in those early Kubrick films, which are based on pulp novels, he often uses a voiceover. And I was just wondering, what are some other ways that filmmakers deal with the issue of narrative voice?
Let's say that voiceover is something that's kind of the easy escape, but it doesn't work for a lot of people. In the case of Kubrick, it does work, but it can be really tricky. But it's also interesting to note how books that are in the first person are the books that are most likely to be adapted to films, because we kind of invest ourselves when we have a narrative voice that's accompanying the book. But it also means that you have to make choices. So other ways to deal with it might be the director being the narrator, so the director being the omniscient narrator of all the things. And this means that you find yourself with some gaps, because you have things that are not in the book's narrator's radar, but they have to be there. So I'm thinking, for example, about Call Me By Your Name, which is narrated through the protagonist, Elio. But then in the script written by James Ivory and the author of the book, it's more of not first person narration, but more of an objective version. And you can see the gaps, because you can see the love interest of Elio, Oliver, not being clearly portrayed. I personally didn't understand why Elio would grow such a obsession for him, because the character is a little bit 2D. Other ways to deal with it, I think, might be trying to find similar or a different tone to have a personality for the movie adaptation. And I'm thinking of American Psycho, who is narrated through the eyes, the words of the protagonist, who is describing everything about his life in a matter-of-factly tone, from the cleanser he's using for his face to the clothes he's putting on, the brands he's using. And in the same tone, he's describing in detail all his horrifying killings. So the director, Mary Harron, for her 2000 adaptation of the movie, I think she went for a grotesque tone. So everything is narrated in a surreal, grotesque way. So she did the choice of finding a different tone for the film, to probably the easy mistake that a lot of adaptation, a lot of the screenwriters and the director make, is to use voiceover abundantly. And I'm thinking of Haruki Murakami's adaptation, Norwegian Wood, by Trunan Jung.
Let me set up the story
a
little bit for you. So Norwegian Wood, set in the 1960s in Japan, and it's the story of Toru Watanabe, who's a university student who's coming to terms with the suicide of his friend Kazuki. And when Toru bumps into Naoko, Kazuki's former girlfriend, they fall in love, or at least Toru falls in love. Naoko, however, is mentally unwell, and she goes to a countryside sanitarium. Toru continues to visit her, but meanwhile, he meets another girl. He meets Midori, who is a very different kind of personality, very uninhibited. And the book, really, its themes are about grief, loss, and communication.
So first of all, the book is a big flashback. So all is triggered by him being at the age of 37, traveling in Germany, and he's on the plane, and he happens to listen to Norwegian Wood, which is the favorite song of Naoko. So this moment triggers all this flashback. And what the director does is to break it down to the narration point, to the plot point, and he reconstructed like chronologically. The first faux pas that we see is the first images are of Kizuki and Naoko. So we are kind of triggered to think that it's their story. So that's number one. It's a little bit confusing, probably for someone who hasn't read the book. And second of all, is very tricky because the narration of the plot is only one level, and we have the other level, which is the level of the mind work of Toru. And these two parts rarely are connected. His actions are very non-heroic. It's just going to university, following classes, and being very kind of plain. And what happens in his mind is totally different. This element, the director is trying to solve by using a lot of voiceover and a lot of the exposition that's in the book. It's Murakami's words, but not originally, because a lot of the parts are simplified.
Yeah, so the film really imposes this kind of linear narrative of
Yes.
what is clearly a book that delves into the emotions
Yes.
that people are feeling and like the mental turmoil. That's where the drama is.
Yeah.
The conflict that you need to make a film or to tell a story. Here it's very kind of muted, right?
Yes, because a lot of the things are important or assume significance by the fact that they're rediscovered in a different time, like a year later or months later. Once you decide to narrate the story in its chronological order, you lose that.
And did you feel the characters were representative of the characters in the novel, Ian?
And for me, it just misses out too much of the novel, as Maria was saying, because you don't get enough of the character's backstory or the impact of their actions. Everything kind of makes sense, like logically happens because the director rearranged it, but you don't really understand why anybody's doing what
Yeah,
they're
there's
doing.
not a lot of clear motivation. People do things in this film for no obvious reason. Similarly, there's a lot of unmotivated physical action in the frame, people walking backwards and forwards.
And you do get that in Murakami books, but at the same time as they're walking aimlessly around Tokyo or wherever it is, you're also getting their internal monologue, and that's where you start to learn about their motivations. I know not everything can make it into the film, but if you just cherry pick the bits you want or the bits that seem as the most dramatic and leave out the connecting scenes, you can't expect it to sort of make narrative, but also you can't expect it to make emotional sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So in one way, like, it was kind of true to the Murakami original, because often Murakami's books leave me really, really frustrated, but it's usually frustrated in a really good way, because you want, something wasn't resolved and it leaves you thinking about it, or you want to spend more time with these characters because you want to see what they're going to do next. But in this film, it just left me really frustrated with what could have been. I don't think it's a bad film, but I don't think it's particularly true to the source material, and it's just a bit hollow.
Yeah, I think I was mostly disappointed because what this book provides, and it's not a frequent thing in Japanese literature, in the literature of the time of Murakami, he is describing interesting female characters, all of them different from each other. And I'm particularly disappointed by the adaptation of the Reiko character. Reiko is this woman who, in the book, she's about the age of the actress because she's like late 30s, 40, but she's described as a woman that defines herself old. But she's very charming, she's very beautiful, but beautiful in a non-sexualized way, because she's very vibrant, way of talking is very unusual. And this does not reflect at all in the choices of the movie. This person is this kind of mature woman, and the risk is whatever happens next, it feels like a bad porn flick. At the end, Reiko spends the night with Toru. But in the book, it's totally unexpected. It's something so unusual, so non-sexual, that it's totally different what the movie suggests.
She's the most fascinating character
Yes.
for me in the book, because the way you initially think she's going to be, and then the way she acts, and then that final bit with Toru is amazing. It completely takes you by surprise. But
Yes.
yeah, in the movie she feels so 2D, and you don't explore her motivations, and I don't know how she would have made sense to anybody that hadn't read the book.
Yes, exactly.
The thing here is there's a missed opportunity. For example, when we're talking about the characters sort of suppressing their inner turmoil, that seems to me to be something that we see in Japanese narratives, Japanese fiction all the time. And perhaps a Japanese director could have done a more interesting job of it.
I've seen the film he became famous for, which is The Scent of Green Papaya. And it's a film not about words, and it's also a film about Vietnam in 1950s. So it's more about what you cannot say and the situation in the society, the women's role in society. So there's a lot of unsaid, a lot of inner turmoil that comes from the expression. So he would have been a good candidate to make a film about Japanese society in the 60s, in the 70s, where things that we can notice even now, which is not being able to verbalize a lot of things, but having this kind of inner life, could have been translated better.
Do you think that moving the action to a different location would have helped things?
I think it might have helped. I mean, because the director's already dealing with what's very famous and seminal book. They're already quite far outside of their comfort zone because it's a Japanese book. It's set in Tokyo. Maybe it would have worked to move it to Vietnam, or maybe move it to another city, maybe somewhere where the director himself felt more at home and more comfortable. It would have distanced it slightly more from the book, because it feels like a pale version of the book. And then to move it somewhere else, maybe it would have breathed some more life into the film itself.
Well, Burning did well, and Burning just brought the action to Korea.
I'm really looking forward to seeing Burning. I haven't
Yeah,
seen
me
it
too.
yet.
With Norwegian Wood, I felt as though I was watching TV a lot of the time, and not the peak TV kind. It just felt too contrived. It's a different film, Die, but Cloud Atlas had 3 directors, $102 million budget. Was it enough?
Probably not. I mean, Cloud Atlas is one of those books. I mean, I think we can sort of separate these two into two distinct things, because this is an adaptation that tries to be very, very faithful to the actual source material. David Mitchell's book, it's century spanning, it's culture, it's all these different like times. It's just so complicated.
Right.
So many characters.
David Mitchell's book, like other books of his, it spans centuries. It has a large cast of characters, and they are all in different parts of the world. In this particular story, it also goes into the future.
Yes.
So we go from, I think, a ship in the 1800s, late 1700s, something like that, to the far future. When you make a film like this, it's going to be ambitious.
Yeah, one of the sort of the key parts of the book is the fact that there are souls. It's actually one of the revelations the book has later on, that you realize, oh, this is the same soul. So the things that are happening to this character, within that character is this specific soul. You click and you realize that we're witnessing the events of this one specific thing. It's just in a different body, in a different entity. There is Hugo Weaving as a Chinese character, and it's horribly awkward.
Yeah. Taking the same actors and then asking them to play people from different parts of the world. That you immediately get into the question of why not have someone from that part of the world play that character? You know, you get a blackface.
I think the answer for that is they were trying to keep it in tune with the soul. So this specific actor is playing that soul. It just happens to be in the specific bodies. But if we can use the same actor for all these different things, then it makes sense, because you've got the visual connection. You go, oh, that's that thing, that soul. I understand that's who that is. And it works in the book, because you understand the character, but visually it doesn't look good.
That's right. It ends up looking like a school musical where you've got kids playing an older character, Henry Higgins, but with a kind of a big white cotton beard.
And so this very core thing from the book becomes, I think, an almost unfilmable element in the film. It comes from a pure place. We know now the Wachowskis were both transitioning from being men into women. They are now the Wachowski sisters. And their TV show, Sense8, deals a lot with not feeling like you're in the right body, or sort of the trans issues in a way. And so I think there is space and scope to explore a lot of these issues in the film. And it's done from a place of innocence. It's got nothing to do with sort of racism, and it's done from a place of purity. But when you see it on the screen, all of these issues are present, and you can't escape it.
Yes, this kind of uncanny valley thing's happening. Ian, in today's Hollywood, does budget trump vision?
I mean, I think the simple answer is yes, but it's obviously much more complicated than that. Depending on, we used to be in a position where to film some of these movies, we had to wait until the technology caught up or enough money could be available to do it. And the problem is now, when there's so much money involved, the vision goes away, because if it's going to cost that much, it has to make that much money back, that it becomes almost franchised of a novel. So you lose the vision of the source material, but you may also lose the vision of the director. Something like we mentioned earlier, Fear and Loathing, because it's quite low budget, and because they had to sort of improvise and sort of make it up as they were going along, it managed to keep that vision. If you now made Fear and Loathing for a couple of $100 million, the vision of the book would have gone away. So the more money involved, of course, more control from the studio. Perhaps what made the book special in the first place is lost.
If a director isn't willing to compromise his or her vision.
The conditionings of making a movie now are completely different to, say, the 70s, when if you didn't get that shot, there was nothing you can do. Say you lose the light and you're now filming in darkness, you can't change that. Nowadays, it doesn't even matter. You can film on a green screen, and there are some instances now where I can't even tell if it's a green screen anymore. The technology has gotten to the point where I think getting that vision has become a lot easier. But I find it fascinating when we go back into the past and we start looking at films and getting that vision. It was like a director's passion, and they would put people through hell to make sure they got the shots they wanted. There are horror stories out there of them doing this, and one of those horror stories is Apocalypse Now.
Do you want to quickly explain for the half dozen listeners who haven't seen it what the film's about?
Apocalypse Now is Francis Ford Coppola's probably most important film, and that's saying a lot because he's made a lot of very important films. It's based on the book by Conrad, A Heart of Darkness, and it's set in the Vietnam War. The story of how this movie got made. American Zoetrope was the company, and it was headed by Francis Ford Coppola. Mm-hmm. Francis Ford Coppola was joined by Lucas, Goddard, Kurosawa, and then the list goes on.
De Palma was there as a writer, yeah.
So many people. Coppola and Lucas were looking to produce movies to speak to young people and define the Vietnam War. I mean, the Vietnam War hadn't actually even finished, and they were trying to make a movie about it, which is crazy. You wouldn't even do that now.
That's right. They were seriously considering filming with, I think Lucas is the director, seriously considering filming in Vietnam while the war was playing out.
Can you imagine?
No.
No, it was like, no.
And also, who would insure that?
No one's ensuring that. Well, that's a different... It's a
It's a
different
totally
time.
different-
Different
It's a
time.
totally
Well,
different thing.
it was more possible like in the 40s during World War II because Rossellini's Roma città aperta, Rome Open City,
Yeah,
that was
that's
filmed during the war. So they were still fighting against the Nazis and everything was blocked and all the situation that you see is not fiction. It's the actual situation. But that was no problem.
That's
you know.
real Gonzo.
But at that time, I don't think they were thinking about insurance and things like that. So that was not a problem.
And I don't think we can separate the politics of this. I mean, you could not have asked for more of a red-hot button. And for a while it looked as if Lucas was going to actually make the movie, the actual honour would end up falling to Coppola. And what follows is a story of movie-making hell that just, luckily enough, results in what is an incredible piece of work. The filming of Apocalypse Now has gone down in history as one of the most volatile, dangerous, and ultimately creative in movie history. And it's an incredible story.
Ian, how did it come to land at Zoetrope?
Well, short answer, Coppola's an obsessive maniac, but the longer answer is Orson Welles originally did write a screenplay for it in 1939, but he wanted to star as both Marlowe and Kurtz in it. He wanted to be both characters.
Oh, okay.
Go back to the maniacs.
So him.
The IKEA president, George Safer, was concerned that, one, it was going to cost too much money, and two, that Orson Welles perhaps wouldn't be able to direct and star, but also he was genuinely concerned about adapting that kind of literary masterpiece to film. So Akio asked Welles to make something a little bit more conventional, so he made Citizen Kane.
Very conventional.
And then it ended up with Milius, who's part of the Zoetrope sort of collective, I guess, was encouraged by Lucas and Spielberg to write a war film. But Milius had this want to do it as well. He originally tried to volunteer for the Vietnam War, but he was turned down due to his being an asthmatic, which is something I can appreciate. Anyone who's listening can hear me wheezing all over the microphone. He originally entitled it The Psychedelic Soldier. So I think some of that influence got into the final pitch.
But actually, I read that too. But then lately I came across the interview that Francis Ford Coppola did to John Milius, and he denied it. He said it was just a rumor, that it was always Apocalypse Now.
Well, there's also the rumor that long ago that his English professor challenged the students to write a version of Heart of Darkness because he said it was impossible to do. But it wasn't the idea originally that Milius was supposed to direct it, but he actually wrote it for Lucas, and then you get into that whole Lucas wanted to film it in the Vietnam War. But obviously the studios had some safety concerns.
In the words of Francis Ford Coppola, he said he just did Star Wars and had tasted a little bit success and money. So he was now willing to go, according to the original plan, to Vietnam to film like a pseudo documentary in 16 mil and do something very like cinema verite. But later on, I think that he really was not interested. So I think it was more John Milius that was interested in going to Vietnam and do it. And he says that maybe you could not find people that wanted to fight, but you would find a lot of people who wanted to film in Vietnam.
Some of this sort of documentary filmmaking actually makes it into the film itself, with the fantastic scene when they're storming up the beach and Francis Ford Coppola is there with a full camera crew and he's going, don't look at the camera,
Look at the
keep
camera.
running,
Yeah.
don't look at the camera, and it's just perfect.
And everybody, of course, stops and looks at the camera.
Yeah.
And
But is that-
Sheen does, for sure.
But is that keep fighting or keep... What was the original line? I read somewhere that he said, don't look at the camera, keep fighting.
And is Terraro the cameraman in that
Yes,
shot? I think
yes,
he is.
He is.
But it was finally filmed in the Philippines.
Yeah,
And this
it was
due
shot in
to-
the Philippines.
It's due to Fredrickson, and Fred Roos had connections. They made a couple of low-budget films in the Philippines already, and they knew they could get the access to cheap labor, and the American sort of equipment was there. But then it didn't get even more weird, where Fredrickson made a deal with the president of the Philippines at the time, so they could use the actual soldiers.
The army helicopters or the Air Force helicopters.
Meanwhile, Coppola's back in Hollywood, convincing United Artists that he was making a movie that was going to star Marlon Brando, Steve McQueen, and Gene Hackman. So that's how they ponied up half the money. But it turned out it was nowhere near the amount of money required.
Let's talk a little bit about how it translates from the original setting, which is the Congo. How does it translate to Vietnam? Maria?
Yeah, so the idea that unites Heart of Darkness and Vietnam is due to John Milius. And the way he read Heart of Darkness when he himself was a teenager is a very military kind of way of reading it, because his interpretation is that the fear of darkness, the only way to fight it is to surrender to the darkness and for the jungle to go way into the jungle. And he's talking about doing this in Colorado where he grew up, like learning to spend the night sleeping against a tree, and then you learn how to just sleep with a knife, and then you give up to it's a very military approach.
One great thing about John Milius, he is this close to self-parody at all times.
Yes.
And that's why he was the basis for Walter Sobchak and Big Lebowski.
And he looks like John Goodman in The Big Lebowski. actually,
designed to look like John Milius.
He dressed like that. He talks like that. He's really, and you can see that he's deeply motivated by his thoughts, and it's very fascinating to see him.
Yeah, listeners, please go out, find any interview with John Milius, particularly the one that's certainly on YouTube, the John Milius and Coppola interview.
It is on YouTube, and I think it's an interview in some kind of wine canteen, because I can see the oak
bottles in the back.
Yes. And personally, I was really curious to see how this encounter between the two of them would happen, because notoriously Milius was not happy about the way that his script was, especially towards the ending, was adapted or was put in film by Francis Ford Coppola, and he made no mystery in saying that the problem was Coppola's ego and the fact that everything had to be according to his own vision. And he, with a lot of affection, he called him the Bay Area Mussolini. So, but in this interview, Coppola is clearly, he wants Milius to have the share of the glory, because a lot of people think that a lot of the inventions of the films are due to Coppola, but they are in the original script. So going back to the original question, this is the first time, with this person reading of Heart of Darkness, is the first time that this novella gets linked to Vietnam. And Milius' personal obsession about Vietnam, not being able to go there, it was as soon as people were coming back from Vietnam, he wanted to hear their stories, and he was looking for a script that could tell the story of Vietnam. And he thought about conveying this with his love and his really military interpretation of Heart of Darkness.
Well, I think one of the things that this film does very successfully is it takes a whole range of different voices and puts them all together at the end. So Coppola had no real ending to this film. He had a big shootout, a big battle scene that Milius had written, and he wasn't able to do it, simply didn't have the money. But he was able to take other types of materials, say the big sacrifice at the end, to show the psychology of people facing their demons, which is the Heart of Darkness of the title. In the end, Coppola's film is really this kind of fantasia. In the documentary Hearts of Darkness, the filmmakers are seen really struggling to come to terms with the film, come to terms with the book, and to come to terms with the war. And that, they say, is the experience of Vietnam. Honestly, I feel that necessity is the mother of invention, and that Coppola was able to bring all the threads together. Now, some people don't like the end of the film, but for me, I think it really works. Maria, does pulp lend itself to adaptation more easily than capital L literature?
Yeah, I think easily yes, because pulp literature is not so much about introspection of the characters, it's not so much about themes, it's more about action. And when there's a narrative voice, it's usually the detective voice, so it's part of the plot. You can easily visualize it in your head. And for example, I'm thinking for the 40s and 50s, I'm thinking about James M. Cain and his works like Postman Always Rings Twice or Double Indemnity.
There are many films that actually improve on the source material, and I'm thinking of like The Godfather, Silence of the Lambs, and our favorite, Jaws.
In the case of Jaws, it's kind of pulpy. It's like a summer book. And there are some sort of narrative threads within the book which aren't included in the film at all, like Matt Hooper having an affair with Brody's wife, and who is then actually killed by the shark when he goes down in the tank. And the reason that changed in Jaws the movie was because they had a little person that they were going to use in real life, with real life sharks. They have a little person to try and scale up the shark. And one of the sharks got caught in the cage and destroyed it, and he refused to get in the other cage that they had. And so they had to change his ending, the Matt Hooper character. It's not an incredible book, it's kind of fun, but it's a sort of book where someone smart can point at an idea and go, that's going to work visually on film. It's the same thing with The Godfather. It was like, these are classic books, and they're very good, but it's not necessarily the quality of the original source material that dictates whether it's going to be a good movie.
And isn't there a problem, Ian, that no matter what kind of novel you adapt, you're always at risk of angering fans?
To be honest, if you are so in love with the book or the source material, be that a graphic novel or manga itself, I think, yes, ultimately they're never going to be satisfied. Because when you read the book, you have so many ideas yourself about how the person looks or the way they would sound, or you get invested in those characters. And I think even the truest of adaptations of the source material, it's never really going to satisfy diehard fans. You've got something like Zack Snyder's Watchmen, where if you look at the still scenes in that film, they are exactly the same as panels in the graphic novel itself, but that doesn't make it a good film.
The actual adaptation that changes the source material is something that's kind of dying out. Die Hard was a book originally, and The Shining was also famously a book by Stephen King, which got changed dramatically, in my opinion, for the better, because Stanley Kubrick, he knew what he was doing and he was telling a different kind of story. It's elevated from being sort of a kind of trashy novel about an alcoholic into something that's more deeply rooted in sort of the American culture. And I mean, that film has been analysed to the hilt. But over the years now, I feel like we've had so many adaptations which have been able to sort of utilise technology and create a largely faithful vision of what's on the page, that making changes has angered so many people, and the internet is such a vocal community of people. They have the power to kind of boycott things now, and I feel like taking a risk and changing something that is popular is going to work against a film, regardless of the quality of the end product.
So we should take no risks then.
It's what I'm saying, but I mean, but we're going to sit here going, we like films that take risks, and if I read a book, I don't necessarily want to see that book.
But isn't that the crux of this issue, that everybody wants to see people take risks, but nobody wants to see a film that takes risks with that book that they love?
Yeah, not the thing I love. And this
Right.
is it. It's like when people have a vision of a character in mind, and then they cast an actor, and they're like, oh no, I didn't think of him. It's like with Heath Ledger cast as the Joker. Oh, he's just a pretty boy. He does like romantic comedies. He won't be the Joker. Probably the best Joker that's ever
Daniel
been.
Craig is another great example.
Yeah. Oh, he's blonde. He can't be Bond. He's got blue eyes. Oh my God. It's like, I hate the internet.
Yeah, so I think ultimately the problem is it's more like, what is the expectation?
A particular problem when they take the source material and they go in a completely different direction with it. One of my favourite series of books is Dune. I've read everything about Dune, the Children of the Dune, everything, even some of the ones that aren't written by the original author. And then you get the David Lynch version, and that it's very far away from.
Okay, so I'll try and set up Dune a little bit. It's a sprawling science fiction epic, a space opera. It's set in a universe where the number one commodity is this spice, and it's found only on this one planet, Arrakis, also known as Dune. The hero of this story is Paul Atreides, who's a noble son of Duke Leto. And if I remember correctly, Leto is betrayed and murdered by the Harkonnen. There's this kind of evil baron who has him murdered. The story basically follows Paul as he works to secure the planet Arrakis and defeat the Harkonnen.
And what Dune does is it's such world building. Like if you read the other books as well, you get to learn about the other planets, you get to learn about the worms. It goes so in depth into this amazing world. And then David Lynch is an amazing director, but I did not perhaps need to see this dark vision that he produced. Although we did get to see Sting in tiny pants with his shirt off, so it wasn't all bad.
Oh, again with the tiny pants.
And I saw it as a young, impressionable child to see, Ginger Man on stage, letting it all hang
Things
out.
you don't want to remember.
No, it may have had an impact on me.
Di, how successful an adaptation is your namesake's version of the film?
It depends how we're really going to grade this, isn't it? Because, like, how do we judge success? Do we judge it on the monetary value?
From one Lynch to another.
From one Lynch to another, yeah. I mean, at the time, people were not happy with the film. And I think you could probably put that down to the fact that it was kind of a bit of a mess, narratively speaking. A lot of the vision of the book, which people wanted to see, didn't translate onto the screen. And maybe that's to do with the special effects and the limitations
It's
they have.
definitely pre-CG, right?
Yeah, but if you watch on a high-def version now, there's some of the special effects with the shields they have when they have the sword fights, the sort of the knife fights. That kind of looks kind of cool. So there's
And some of the spacecraft looked amazing.
yeah, and it's comparable to Star Wars in terms of scope and the actual effects that they're using. Obviously, all practical, all models. Sandworms look amazing. They look really good. I think what happens with this film is that they crammed too much in. They tried to get the Atreus storyline to an endpoint, a satisfying endpoint in one film, which you can't do because his story spans years.
Yeah, it's multiple books, right?
Yeah, and he becomes the savior of Dune, doesn't he? Because he's the one essentially, isn't he? And he's the one who's going to lead them. So it's that old chestnut. Exactly. It doesn't come together as well as it could. I think David Lynch wasn't on board the entire time. He came on later. I also think it's one of those films that have been unfairly tarnished because of the initial reaction people had to it at the time. Even now, it's a film where it has cult status. I mean, people will watch this film, and it's one of the ones like 2001. If you have some substances, you watch this film, it can be a trip.
Maria, I know you just saw the documentary about Alejandro Jodorowsky's version of the film. He failed to get the film made. What do we miss out on?
First of all, this documentary is a beautiful story of the most incredible film that was never made. We miss out on a film that features Orson Welles as Baron Harkonnen, Mick Jagger, and Salvador Dali. I would want to watch that. The rest of it, of course, his vision, his visionary layout of the movie was too early for the time. I think probably
So
now...
we're talking pre-Star Wars.
Pre-Star Wars, pre-everything. So I think probably even now, I'm not sure that the modern CGI techniques would be enough to fulfill the vision he had, seeing all the...
Just that opening sequence as it was planned. There was this
Yes.
long shot
Yeah.
zooming in through space into the center of one galaxy.
Yeah.
And then keep zooming
Zooming
into a particular planet. I mean, that's spectacular.
He involved all the most visionary illustrators of the time.
So Mobius,
Giga, O'Bannon, that ended up then working together in different films like Alien. So he was really a forerunner for so many reasons. So
well, a lot of the material ended
Yeah.
up elsewhere, which is great
yes,
for us.
which is so frustrating. Also for us watching, and I cannot even imagine what it must have been for Jodorowsky, who's seen his vision. Let's not forget that the movie storyboard was finished. I don't know how many 100 pages, like more than 1,000 pages and 90 scenes of
Referring to
storyboard.
that massive
The
book
massive
that
thing
sits
that
on the table.
apparently is in every studio. So every studio owns a copy. I don't know what I would pay for have that in my hand and flip through it for 10 minutes. I'm not asking too much.
Tasha will have a copy of
Yes.
it out eventually.
Yeah. And I would totally want to see an exhibition on that. It's really something that I'm very, very curious to see. So I think that the only way to do it would probably be through animation, and thinking Japanese animation could do that. And the way Jodorowsky decided to put this creative force was into illustration. So he's writing the script with Mobius. I think they're doing a series based on that with a lot of elements. And I think with the modern technology, you can do that as an animation. That would be a great project. I'm very curious to see what Villeneuve is doing, but I think the most effective way would be through animation.
I'd still prefer Sting in his little pants than Mick Jagger.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, so here's the kicker. Can a film translate the experience of reading a book? And I'm going to start with you, Ian.
Ultimately, probably not. There's something special about sitting down with a book and losing yourself in it. It's even something that I read a lot of books on my Kindle, but I feel like even by reading on my Kindle, I'm kind of cheapening the experience. It's that sitting with a book, losing yourself, and putting as much of yourself into the book as the source material itself. And I think with a film, if you want to like the film, you really have to put the book away and not think about it.
Di.
They are separate experiences. They are utilizing different senses to tell their story and treat the experience in a different way. Films are a visual medium. They always have been. It's why I will point at something like Mad Max Fury Road and go, that is a pure filmic experience. That would not be. Can you imagine the book of that film? He runs. He jumps. He's on the car. There's a chain. Oh my God! It just wouldn't translate. And there is a distinction and there's a separation, but that doesn't mean they're mutually exclusive things. The interplay between them is really fascinating, and it will keep us talking for ages.
How about you, Maria?
Well, I'll give you an example of a film I love and a book I love. Both are Breakfast at Tiffany. The film could not be more unfaithful to the book, and that's the key to it. Reading is this experience that the common thing that I found both watching John Milius' interview and Jodorowsky. So John Milius, he was about to write this screenplay based on Heart of Darkness, but he didn't reread Heart of Darkness because he said, for me, it was still a dream. And Jodorowsky says, this is my dream. So I think that a book, once you read it, it's really, you are in that area of dream, in that dreamlike area that's really difficult. That's why probably we feel betrayed when we see the movie. But I think that ultimately it's like dreaming and reality. You cannot say no to either of it. I think you need both, dreaming and watching reality.
No, rereading the book, giving hope to literature students everywhere. Ian, I know we had a lot of feedback from our social media peeps this week.
Yeah, so this is the most responses we've ever had, so that was very nice. We asked 2 questions this month. So first we asked, what adaptations worked? What adaptations do you wish they had never touched? So we had quite a few people suggested Watchmen, including show favourite J.C. Carty. He's back. It's a full 100% streak. He's been on every show. On the question of whether anything's unfilmable, he said, with the right team and skill, I don't think anything has to. Film will always need to take creative liberties in order to access it to a wider audiences. He says he loved Zack Snyder's Watchmen, but the ultimate cut wasn't released in theatres, so most people made their judgment based on the shorter theatrical release.
There's an ultimate cut? I didn't even know
There's a much longer cut. Nick Harling disagreed. He said, my body rejects that movie like a bad kidney transplant. And this is lovely. So on the back of JC's comment, one of my other flatmates from university, Owen Millard, got in touch. So there's quite a nice reunion and podcast comments. So he said Lord of the Rings was supposedly unfilmable, but the CGI and Peter Jackson made it possible. But then, as he put it, he arsed it up with the Hobbit films. Ray Mera, Beat Jacker's favourite, is back again. And as Ray says, he's not a book reader, but he thinks they should have left A Wrinkle in Time completely alone. And our second question was, what books would you like to see made into a movie? And we had a wonderful correspondence from a man whose name, as I can only describe as, looks like a burst bag of Scrabble letters. So he seems a very lovely man. So I reached out to him on Facebook, and he has already told me I'm allowed to screw this up. But I believe his name is Tryggva Bejelvrak. And I have no idea. I'm going to ask Di, because he's your friend.
How close is it?
I just call him Trig.
That's not fair.
Okay, well, Trigger. He says he'd like to see the Foundation series by Asimov on the big screen. He's not sure that would quite be the right format or if it'd be enjoyable, but he'd love to see someone have a go at that. His other suggestion is also The Neuromancer by Gibson, which is something I would love to see, but it might be one of those ones that I actually don't want to see.
Actually, Trig and I have very similar tastes because I love the Foundation series and I also love Neuromancer, both of which I read when I was a teenager. I'm not sure either of them could be brought to the screen, though. I would be very cautious if I were asked to greenlight either of those.
And apparently I love choosing complicated names because lovely Gareth's been in touch, and I will attempt his surname, Vietsko. Di, is that close enough? I'm getting the thumbs up. He suggests Use a Weapon by Ian M. Banks. As he put it, would be so good. And Corrado Morgana?
Corrado Morgana.
Corrado Morgana also suggests anything by Ian M. Banks. And again, that's something very close to my heart. I've read most of the sci-fi and the non-sci-fi from Banks, so I would love to see that.
I just want to apologise to everyone whose names we mispronounce. Whether you're an actor, whether you're a director, we humbly apologise.
Daniel Carras, who's the drummer in Jimmy Binks and the Shakehorns, who has also been in touch, and some of the Shakehorns have been in touch before. Daniel, you're a drummer. I didn't know you could say anything this intelligent. He suggests The Thousand Autumns of Jacob de Zoet, an epic historical fiction set in the post-Sengoku Jidai island of Dejima. He's not sure who would have the flair to tackle a novel like this, as they'd have to balance a lot of difficult elements to make the story come to life. He said, so Scorsese did manage it with something like Silence, but as this book has elements of magical realism, he's not sure that Scorsese would be interested. He suggests Denis Villeneuve or Alfonso Cuarón.
Yeah, it's another great book from David Mitchell. This one would be easier to adapt than Cloud Atlas, that's for sure. And I totally agree, choosing the right director for that project would be important.
So maybe not Michael Bay for this one. Our last comment, and I can definitely read this name, is from Dave Brown. Love you, Dave. He asks, is the success of a film's adaptation of a book measured by how faithful it is to the source? He goes on to say one of his favourite films is The Shining, but he would concede that it's a terrible representation of the source material. He doesn't even think that Kubrick bothered to read the book.
Look, I'm sure he read the book. I'm absolutely sure of that. But at the same time, it's a very good question. The success of a film compared with the book. I mean, they're different things. They're completely different beasts. So
Okay, and that's the end of our correspondence this week.
that's the end of the correspondence
That's the end
section.
of the correspondence section.
There's a lot of correspondence this
There's
week.
a lot of
Ian.
correspondence, and I would encourage everyone that did reply, thank you so much. Not all your comments can make it into the show. I encourage you to like the Facebook page, as we'll be putting more of the questions up there from now on.
And finally, our picks for books we'd like to see as films. Maria.
Don DeLillo's White Noise. Why? Because I know that Don DeLillo's narrative and voice is very difficult to transfer to images, but in this novel, the characters are so interesting that I would like to see them in live action. The director I'm thinking is the Coen brothers. Well, I know that the protagonist is the head professor of Hitler studies, but the use of Hitler, the use of it's like when he says, "Oh, I'm going to discuss that I'm bringing Mein Kampf with me," it's all very, very grotesque humor. So I think they would handle it very well. And I would like to see the character of the protagonist's wife, Fifth's wife, Babette, played by Kate Winslet.
Okay, great. Ian.
I'd love to see something from Pratchett's Discworld, and they've attempted before to put some stuff onto TV, but none of it's really rung very true for me. And because the world's so kind of scrungy and dark and kind of weird, I'd love to see what Guillermo del Toro would do with some of those kind of physical effects.
Nice.
And I would love to see Brendan Gleeson play Captain Vimes, because every time Vimes is in the books, that's just who I think of when he's there.
I like your casting there. Di.
For me, for a long time, it was getting a proper adaptation of his Dark Materials onto the screen. Obviously, we had the really quite mediocre Golden Compass. Didn't enjoy it at all. The BBC's finally got their adaptation off the ground now, and the trailer dropped for it the other day, so I'm quite excited about that. So I'm going to go with something probably really rather unfilmable, which would be the Ian M. Banks culture novels, starting with Consider Phlebas, because that book was just breakneck, non-stop. Incredible storytelling.
He's a great writer.
I'd love to see Fearsome Injun as well. Just for the way they do the first half of the book written phonetically would be amazing.
What about you, Marcus?
I'd like to see an adaptation of one of my very favourite novels, Cocaine Nights, directed by Jonathan Glazer, maybe starring Cillian Murphy. I'd like to have another choice, as is my prerogative as host. I'd also like to see Roberto Bolaño's Savage Detectives adapted for the big screen by any of the three big Mexican directors. You've been listening to The Last Picture House. Be sure to let us know what you think of the show on Twitter, where we're at Last Pick House. Follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, where we're Last Picture House, one word. And we'll be back soon with another episode.
Actually, I've changed my mind. Can I see Michael Bay's Little Women?